Hello and welcome.
Tonight, we are not here for the noise and urgency of the modern world. We are here for the quiet, forgotten echoes of the past. There is a space, a comfortable, hazy space, just between waking and sleeping, where the mind is open to wandering. And tonight, we will let it wander. We will drift back together, not into the clang of armor or the shouts of revolution, but into the quiet, overlooked moments of life as it once was. So, find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders soften and your breathing slow. Dim the lights if you haven't already, and give yourself permission to let go. There is nothing you need to do, nothing you need to remember. Your only task is to listen, to float on the sound of my voice as we ease into tonight's journey. We begin our journey with something fundamentally familiar, something you are hopefully, even now, beginning to embrace, the simple, necessary act of sleep. But we will explore it in a time long past, in a world lit only by the flickering of fire and the silver of the stars. A world where the night was vast, dark, and filled with a meaning we have long forgotten. It was a time when to sleep was not just a biological function, but an act of faith, and sometimes an act of courage. Let's begin our journey in the deep, enveloping darkness of the medieval night. Tonight, we begin with this most relatable of human needs, sleep, or perhaps more accurately, how medieval people slept, which, as it turns out, was far weirder, far more structured, and far more interrupted than most of us in our modern comfort could possibly imagine. So, before you get too comfortable, let's consider a world without the hum of electricity, a world where the blue light of smartphones does not exist, a world without TikTok, and certainly a world without sleep hygiene influencers telling us how to optimize our rest. In this world, the setting of the sun was not an inconvenience. It was a profound, non-negotiable end to the day. Medieval people approached the night with a schedule that would baffle the modern melatonin enthusiast. It was a rhythm dictated not by the clock, but by the sun and the needs of the body. It was called segmented sleep. This wasn't a sleep disorder. It was not a sign of stress or anxiety. It was, for centuries, the natural, default, two-part sleep cycle for almost everyone. It was, as the author of our text describes it, split neatly in half, like a stale medieval biscuit. The routine was quite simple. After sundown, as the last light faded from the sky and the air grew cool, the day's heavy physical labor was finished. People gathered in their small homes, perhaps sharing a simple meal by the light of the fire. And then they turned in early. They would drift off into what was known as the first sleep. This first sleep was often deep and restorative, a heavy, dreamless plunge into rest that lasted for about 4 hours. But then something strange would happen to our modern minds. Around midnight, or perhaps a bit after, they would wake up. And this was not a mistake. This was not a jolt of panic or a symptom of insomnia. They would wake up deliberately. This wakening period, nestled between the two sleeps, was known as the watch. It was a recognized, accepted, and even valued part of the nightly schedule. It was seen as a practical, useful, and sometimes even a social part of the night. Everyone from the simplest farmer, his hands raw from the plow, to the most devout monk, participated in this nightly rhythm. It was so normal, in fact, that it appears casually in literature. Figures like Chaucer, the great medieval poet, casually mentioned it in his writings, in the same way one might mention stopping for lunch. It was utterly unremarkable. It was just the schedule, a shared, collective experience of the night. So, what did one do after waking up deliberately at 1 a.m. in a world that was almost completely dark? This period, this watch, was not a time of anxious tossing and turning. It would last for the next hour or two, and people used this time for what can only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This was a quiet, contemplative time, but also an intensely practical one. Imagine waking in the stillness. The first sound might be the breathing of your family, asleep nearby. The first sensation, the cold air on your face. In a house where the fire was the only source of heat and the only source of light, it was crucial. The fire was life. People would use this time to tend the embers, carefully adding wood to ensure the fire wouldn't die out, leaving the home to freeze by morning. It was a vital chore. They might use the dim, flickering light from that same hearth to pray. In a world defined by faith and fear, this was a potent time for reflection, a time to speak to God in the absolute stillness of the deep night. If they were educated and wealthy enough to own a book and a candle, they might use this time to read religious texts, their lips moving silently. It was a time for spiritual housekeeping. For those in the countryside, it was also a time for security. A farmer might rise from his first sleep, pull a cloak around himself, and step out into the cold, sharp air to check on his livestock. He would listen for the sound of a fox or a wolf. He would check that his goat was still in the yard or that his cow was safe. And yes, this period of wakefulness was also considered the ideal time for intimacy. Medieval physicians and even marriage manuals noted that this was a perfect moment for marital relations. The body, they reasoned, was well rested from the first sleep, and the mind was calm, free from the stresses and labors of the day. It was, perhaps, a polite and logical way of finding privacy and energy in a life that offered little of either. So if you ever thought you were romantic for waking up early to make your partner coffee, just know that your ancestors were setting the bar very differently. After this interlude of prayer, chores, or intimacy, people would simply go back to bed. The second sleep would then follow. This sleep was often lighter, more filled with dreams, and would last until the first gray light of sunrise, when the rooster would crow and the day's work would begin all over again. Oddly enough, modern science has begun to catch up with this ancient rhythm. Studies have suggested that this segmented sleep might actually be more natural for humans. The two sleep cycles seems to align with how our circadian rhythms work in the absence of the constant artificial light that bathes our modern world. So, the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., your mind turning, don't panic. You are not broken. You are not failing at sleep. Just whisper to yourself, "Ah, yes, the watch has begun." Your body is just tapping into an ancient, forgotten schedule. Perhaps, as our narrator suggests, you can simply go and tend a symbolic fireplace. It wasn't until the industrial era, with its factories, its gas lamps, and its new, growing, anxious fear of unproductivity, that humans began to enforce the idea of 8 uninterrupted hours. The factory whistle and the time clock became the new masters of the night. Sleep became something to be conquered, a single solid block of downtime, a timed sport rather than a gentle, natural rhythm. But now, let's talk about where they slept. Let's move from the when to the what. Let's talk about beds, or rather, the medieval approximation of them. In our world, we obsess. We obsess over thread counts, over memory foam and cooling gels, over firmness and support. We read reviews to determine if a mattress feels cloud-like. In medieval Europe, a bed was often just a pile of stuff that used to be alive. It was, as our narrator puts it, flattened under the weight of poor sleep and unspoken regrets. The typical peasant bed, the bed for the vast majority of people, was a simple straw mattress. It was known as a pallet. This was, quite literally, straw or hay, often the driest they could find, stuffed into a large sack of rough, scratchy fabric, and that was only if they had the luxury of a sack. If a family was too poor to afford a sack or the fabric to make one, their bed was just straw, a pile of it heaped on the cold, damp earth of the floor, possibly in the corner of their one-room hut. It was a bed that was possibly damp from the rain and possibly already claimed by a cat or a few chickens. These pallets were not comfortable. They were not supportive. But they were better than nothing, which was, quite often, the only alternative. Straw was cheap, and after the harvest, plentiful. It had one great advantage. It was a decent insulator. It provided a crucial barrier against the cold, hard, damp floor, which in winter could feel like a block of ice. It also had a great disadvantage. It was an excellent, thriving metropolis for insects, lice, bed bugs, and the occasional field mouse. The straw rustled and shifted, and so did its inhabitants. This made sleeping an exercise in cautious stillness. You learned to sleep through the itching. If it bit, you just shifted slightly and hoped for the best. You learned to ignore the rustling sounds from beneath you. If a family had a bit more money, or at least a functional back and some woodworking skill, they might elevate that straw mattress onto a simple wooden frame. This was a significant step up. It didn't dramatically change the sleep experience. The straw was still lumpy and full of bugs, but it did reduce the chances of waking up with beetles in your ear, and it kept you out of the worst of the drafts that slithered across the floor. Linens, like the soft sheets we know, were a rare treat for the wealthy. Most common people slept in the same clothes they wore all day, their simple woolen tunics, or perhaps a long, rough nightshirt. Pajamas were not really a thing. And neither, absolutely, was personal space. Our modern idea of a private bedroom is a luxury beyond imagining. In the medieval world, whole families, children, parents, maybe a grandparent, maybe an aunt or uncle, all slept together in the same space. Often, they slept on the very same straw pile, huddled together for warmth. If you got too warm, you could always roll into your cousin's elbow. It was a communal, cramped, itchy, and odorous existence, a pile of humanity and straw against the cold. Nobles, of course, had proper beds, and these beds were statements. They slept on large, intricately carved wooden frames, sometimes so tall they needed steps to get into. They had feather mattresses, which, while luxurious, had to constantly fluffed and were still prone to insects. They had embroidered sheets and, most importantly, heavy canopies. Those velvet or tapestry canopies weren't just for show. not just for decoration. They were a practical, private room within a room. They were designed to be drawn shut, keeping out the cold drafts that haunted even the stone castles, and, hopefully, keeping out the lice, or at least some of the dust and debris from the ceiling. These beds were so valuable, so central to the noble household, that they were prized possessions, passed down in wills alongside land and titles. You didn't just inherit a castle, you might inherit Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy but very valuable feather bed. Still, for most medieval folks, a bed was not a place of comfort. It was a place to not freeze, to avoid the roaming chickens, and maybe, just maybe, to dream of one day being rich enough to sleep on something that didn't rustle or squawk. Now, when we hear the term nightcap today, we think of a cozy little drink, maybe something with whiskey, a warm fire, and a questionable decision. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a beverage. It was a hat. It was a real, tangible, and often ridiculous-looking piece of fabric designed to keep your head from freezing off while you slept. Insulation, as we've noted, was not the strong point of medieval architecture. Stone walls held the cold. Drafty thatched roofs let the wind whistle through. Windows, if they existed at all, were made of thin, oiled parchment or small panes of animal horn. They did not do much against the biting cold of a January night. Central heating, our narrator quips, was called a dog. Since the body loses a great deal of heat fastest through the scalp, medieval people, both rich and poor, adopted the humble nightcap. The most iconic version was long and conical, sometimes with a tassel on the end, like something a wizard might wear. They were usually made from wool, linen, or whatever scrap of warmth could be spared. For women, it sometimes doubled as a coif or head wrap, which also served the dual purpose of maintaining modesty, as married women were often expected to cover their hair at all times, and, practically, covering hair that likely hadn't seen soap since last Lent. These caps were often paired with long, heavy nightshirts. Sleepwear wasn't sexy, but it was practical, itchy, and occasionally flammable. Today, the idea of sleeping next to a stranger is generally limited to red-eye flights, overly ambitious camping trips, or bizarre Airbnb mix-ups. It's an awkward, undesirable situation. But in medieval Europe, this was completely normal and not at all optional. Let's imagine you've been on the road all day. You're cold, you're damp, you're weary to the bone. Or perhaps you're a pilgrim, walking for weeks to a holy site. Or just someone whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich. You finally find an inn, a rare luxury in itself, and ask for a place to sleep. You hand over your coin. What you get is not a room. You do not get your own bed. You do not even get a particularly clean floor. What you get is a spot in a bed that is already occupied. Medieval inns operated more like human bunkhouses than modern hotels. The concept of a private room was reserved for the fabulously wealthy. For everyone else, privacy was not expected. It wasn't even a concept. If the bed had space, you were sharing it. And you were sharing it usually with complete strangers. Strangers who might snore. Strangers who might talk in their sleep. Strangers who might have a suspicious number of boils or who might be carrying a disease. This wasn't considered rude. It wasn't an invasion of privacy. It was just the efficient use of resources. Beds were large and warmth was scarce. These beds could host 2, 3, or even 4 travelers, all crammed in together, depending on their size and social tolerance. In larger cities, you might end up in a vast dormitory-like hall with rows of these large beds and absolutely zero personal space. Snoring contests were unjudged. Elbow territory was fiercely contested. Worried about theft? Of course you were. Many travelers slept with their purse tied directly to their belt under their nightshirt. Or they slept with their purse literally in their hand or under their head. Others slept on top of their bundles, turning their luggage into both a lumpy pillow and a built-in security system. If someone tried to move your bag in the middle of the night, it usually meant you were about to wake up poorer. The rich, naturally, did not suffer this fate. Nobles traveled with their own entourage, their own servants, and often their own collapsible beds, demanding their own rooms if an innkeeper valued their roof. In the medieval world, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and drifting off. It wasn't a simple end to the day. It was a profound spiritual operation. It was a nightly gamble where the stakes were your eternal soul. People didn't just sleep, they prepared to potentially die. This sounds dramatic, but it was their reality. Forget lavender spray or calming podcasts. Medieval sleepers wound down with confessions, psalms, and soul-cleansing spiritual clauses. This was their nightly insurance policy, just in case they died somewhere between good night and dawn. The idea was simple. Life was fragile. You could die at any moment, from illness, from a sudden fire, from demons, or, as our text dryly notes, from, most dangerously, being over 30 in the year 1247. Life was short, and the afterlife was eternal. Therefore, you had better say your prayers. This wasn't necessarily because it was comforting. It was because hell was terrifyingly real, and you did not want to show up at the gates of judgment uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually disheveled. One common children's prayer from the period, which has survived in various forms, captures this anxiety perfectly. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. It sounds sweet to our modern ears, but it's essentially a legal document, a child's first contract with the divine, acknowledging death as a likely and imminent bedtime outcome. Adults had a whole catalog of prayers for different threats. One for when you were feeling guilty, one for when you thought the devil might be hiding in the rafters. The truly devout, like monks, nuns, and overly anxious nobles, ended their day with Compline. This was the final prayer service of the canonical hours, said just before bed. After Compline, they often took a great vow of silence, not speaking again until the next morning. This wasn't hard, because everyone was already exhausted, underfed, and, as we've established, mildly afraid of the dark. Prayer was the shield you held up against the vast, unknown, and dangerous night. In our modern world, dreams are usually dismissed as random neurological nonsense, the result of stress or too much cheese or your brain just trying to file the day's paperwork in the dark. We might see a therapist about a recurring dream, but we don't fear for our eternal soul. But in the medieval world, dreams were taken very, very seriously, as in, eternal consequences serious. Dreams weren't just dreams. They were considered messages, and you had to figure out who the sender was. Was it a message from God? A divine revelation? A warning? Was it a message from a saint? Or was it a message from the devil? A demonic temptation designed to lead your soul astray? Either way, you were supposed to pay attention. You were supposed to analyze it and possibly write it down, or confess it to a priest, or fast for 3 days just to be safe. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries spent an alarming amount of time interpreting dreams. Entire texts, called dream books, were dedicated to decoding them like a holy decoder ring. Dreamt of fire? That might be hell. Dreamt of water? That could mean purification or drowning. Dreamt of a man with a goat's head juggling fish? You had better call a priest immediately. Medieval people believed that what happened in dreams mattered because your soul was still active, still vulnerable, while your body slept. This meant that your actions in a dream could reveal hidden sins or spiritual weaknesses. That mildly embarrassing dream about stealing a loaf of bread? That might be your subconscious confessing your guilt for real-world gluttony. Or it might just be hunger. But still, better to confess it anyway, just in case. Monks and nuns often recorded their dreams in journals and shared them with their spiritual superiors. Some were celebrated for having holy visions during their second sleep. Others were quietly told to eat fewer onions before bed. The church, predictably, was deeply suspicious of all this. Not all dreams were divine. Many, they warned, were planted by demons to corrupt the innocent. If you dreamt of something unwholesome, it could mean your soul was under attack, or that you just slept too close to the fireplace fumes again. In modern times, some people let their pets sleep in the bed. It's a cozy, if occasionally smelly arrangement. It's a sign of affection, a quirky personal choice. In the Middle Ages, however, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't a quirky personal choice. It was a heating strategy. Let's revisit the basics. Medieval homes, especially those of the peasantry, were not built for comfort. They were built to simply stand. They had stone walls or walls of wattle and daub. They had no insulation, and they had drafts so aggressive they probably had names. Central heating, as we've established, was the family pig. In these peasant homes, it wasn't unusual for humans and livestock to sleep in the same room, sometimes in the same bed, and very often on the same pile of straw. The line between the house and the barn was often blurry or non-existent. Chickens wandered freely, roosting where they could. Dogs curled up at your feet, a heavy, warm weight. Pigs, which generate a surprising amount of body heat, snorted softly beside the hearth. This wasn't about affection, though medieval people certainly valued their animals. This was about survival. Animals generate body heat. They were warm, dependable, and unlike some relatives, they didn't hog the blanket. A large dog could keep your toes from freezing. A cow in the corner, separated by a low barrier, might raise the room temperature by a degree or two, which in the depths of January felt like a miracle. These homes often had just one room for everything: cooking, eating, sleeping, working, and occasionally dying. Everyone, humans and animals alike, made do with the same space. Children might be nestled between their parents and a goat, sharing warmth. A chicken might serve as an impromptu and very loud alarm clock. Wealthier families and nobles, of course, didn't usually sleep next to their livestock, but they might still have lapdogs in bed. This wasn't for heat, but for fashion, and, our narrator jokes, for flea redistribution. Some castles even had separate, comfortable sleeping areas for favorite hunting dogs, because nothing says power like a dog with its own room. If you've ever had to share a room at a youth hostel or a college dorm and thought it was a bit much, allow us to introduce the medieval monastic dormitory. This was a place, our narrator writes, where comfort went to die quietly under a vow of silence. Monasteries did not believe in personal space. They did not believe in softness. They did not really believe in fun. The monastic life was a spiritual boot camp designed to break down the individual and the ego. The typical dormitory, or dorter, housed dozens of monks, all sleeping in a single, large, cold room. They were usually arranged in neat rows, like morally upright sardines. Beds, if you could call them that, were often just wooden planks. Sometimes they had a thin straw mattress, if the abbot was feeling generous, or if it was a feast day. And you slept fully clothed. This was not out of modesty, though that was part of it. It was out of pure, cold practicality. Getting dressed in the pitch-black dark at 2 a.m. for prayers was more painful, more of a hassle than just going to bed already prepared. The monastic uniform, the rough wool robe, the belt, the sandals, doubled as spiritual armor and very poor insulation. There were no pillows, no privacy curtains, and absolutely no talking. Silence was not suggested, it was enforced under the strict rule of Saint Benedict. If you rolled over and groaned too loudly, you might find yourself on chamber pot duty for a week. Snoring, however, was a theological gray area. You couldn't control it, but if it became disruptive, the Lord might still hold you accountable. Lighting was minimal. One candle, perhaps, at the end of the hall, just enough to show a shape, but not a face. You didn't need to see. You just needed to lie still and not sin. That was the goal. Monks believed their Spartan beds were training for the afterlife, a preparation for the soul's journey by denying the flesh any excess, any pleasure. Sleep was not a pleasure. It was a necessity, monitored, scheduled, and controlled, just like everything else. Compared to this, the peasant straw piles and snoring pigs almost seemed luxurious. At least the pig didn't judge you. Let's talk about something that would horrify most modern sleepers: waking up voluntarily at 2 a.m. Not for a bathroom break or a doom scroll or a glass of water, but for prayer. Loud, cold, candlelit prayer. In medieval monasteries, this was standard practice. Monks and nuns, who had already been in their first sleep for several hours, followed a rigid daily schedule based on the canonical hours. This schedule included matins, the first service of the day. And by day, we mean the darkest, coldest, quietest part of the night, when even the owls were still deciding whether to wake up. The bell would toll, a single, sharp, iron sound cracking the frozen silence. This bell was often rung by a specific monk who had drawn the short straw, or whose job it was to wake before everyone else. The entire dormitory of robed, sleep-deprived souls would rise from their hard planks. They would shuffle off, in silence, and yes, still in their full clothing, because monks didn't do pajamas. They would proceed in a dark river of robes to the chapel. Inside the chapel, it was vast, stone, and echoing. The only light came from flickering candles on the altar. The monks would stand in their choir stalls, their breath pluming in the cold air, and they would begin to chant. They would recite psalms, they would sing, they would recite scriptures, and they would try their best not to fall asleep on their feet. This was, incidentally, a real and persistent issue. There are records of monks being punished for dozing off mid-prayer, usually with extra chores or, ironically, more prayers. You fell asleep in matins? Congratulations, you now get to lead the next one. Matins could last an hour or more. Some particularly enthusiastic orders, known for their austerity, stretched it to 2. Imagine trying to stay spiritually engaged while your stomach reminds you that dinner was a bowl of lentils and a moral lesson. Your feet are numb with cold, and your body is actively, desperately trying to shut down. After the service, monks would either return to bed for their second sleep or, in stricter orders, move straight into study or manual labor. Because nothing says holy discipline like threshing wheat on 4 hours of fragmented rest. The idea was to sacrifice comfort, to comfort the body, and to dedicate the first and quietest part of the night to God. In our modern world, sleeping alone is often framed as a luxury, a king-size bed to yourself, a sign of independence, peace, or just the glorious ability to control the blanket. In the medieval world, though, sleeping alone was considered suspicious, impractical, or just downright unsafe. Let's start with the basics. As we've established, beds weren't toasty. Stone walls and open chimneys did not trap heat. So, people shared beds for body heat. It was not out of intimacy, though that could be part of it, but out of basic, animal thermal desperation. Children slept with siblings, parents, and sometimes the neighbor's kid if they were visiting. It was like a sleepover, but nobody asked if you wanted to be there. But beyond warmth, there was a profound spiritual reason for sleeping in groups. Many people believed the night was when the devil worked overtime. The darkness was his domain. Alone in the dark, your soul was considered vulnerable, an easy target for temptation or worse, possession. Having others nearby, other breathing Christian souls, created a kind of moral buffer zone. If something went wrong, at least someone would witness it or catch the demon first. Now, if you've ever fallen asleep sitting up in a lecture or on a long bus ride, you probably woke up with a crick in your neck and a deep sense of regret. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping upright wasn't an accident. For some, it was a lifestyle. Some medieval folks, particularly the wealthy or the religiously devout, chose to sleep propped up rather than lying flat. There were a few reasons for this, none of them particularly restful. First, there was a medical belief that lying flat was bad for digestion, the lungs, or the general balance of the bodily humors. In a world where doctors thought a sneeze could rearrange your soul, this logic made perfect sense. Upright sleeping, they believed, helped avoid congestion of the brain, which sounds ominous, but mostly meant don't drown in your own phlegm. Second, There were spiritual concerns. Lying flat was considered too close to the posture of the dead. You didn't want to confuse God, or worse, attract attention from the angel of death by sleeping in the same position used at funerals. Superstitious? Absolutely. As a result, people often slept partially reclined, supported by a large nest of bolsters, pillows, or the wooden headboard equivalent of a medieval lazy-boy. Forget haunted dreams or goblins under the bed. For medieval people, the real monsters of the night were already in the sheets. They were small, persistent, numerous, and entirely uninterested in your prayers. We are talking, of course, about fleas, lice, and the medieval bedroom's unofficial mascot, the bedbug. Let's not sugarcoat it. Hygiene wasn't exactly medieval Europe's strong suit. Baths were rare, laundry was expensive and difficult, and soap was sometimes made from substances better left unnamed. Add that to straw-filled mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional live chicken underfoot, and you have the perfect environment. You have a warm, humid, enclosed space filled with unwashed bodies. You have created an all-you-can-eat pest buffet. Fleas and lice were so common, they were practically roommates. They were a simple, unavoidable fact of life. Peasants dealt with them daily. And nobles, despite their satin sheets and feather beds, were not exempt. In fact, some richer households had dedicated night pickers. These were actual servants. It was their job. They were tasked with the intimate, delicate work of removing lice from their employer's hair and clothing. Imagine that is your job title, Master of the Royal Scalp. Bedbugs, meanwhile, were the silent assassins of medieval sleep. They hid in the wooden bed frames, in the mattress seams, and even in the cracks in the stone walls. They would emerge at night, drawn by warmth and carbon dioxide, to feast like tiny, patient vampires. If you ever wondered why medieval people wore nightcaps and slept fully clothed, it wasn't always about warmth. Sometimes it was pest defense armor, a physical barrier. Solutions ranged from mildly effective to impressively deranged. Some households burned strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy, hoping to repel the bugs. Others slept with garlic, onions, or even ashes in the bed, which may have done little for the pests, but certainly kept romance to a minimum. So, while modern sleep is interrupted by buzzing phones and streetlights, medieval sleep was more likely disturbed by scratching, twitching, and the subtle, creeping feeling that something was crawling on your shin, because it was. We've all had restless nights, but have you ever tried falling asleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron? Now, to be clear, most people, even knights, didn't regularly sleep in full armor. It was hot, heavy, restrictive, and incredibly loud. Trying to roll over in a suit of chainmail, as our narrator notes, is a bit like trying to nap inside a bag of cutlery. But during wartime, or when camped in hostile territory, sleeping partially armored was considered the safer, wiser choice. Comfort was optional. Survival was highly recommended. A knight on campaign might remove only his helmet and his gauntlets. He would keep his mail shirt or his breastplate on, just in case enemies decided to stage a midnight surprise party. There's nothing quite like waking up to the sound of hooves and having to suit up while still half dreaming about turnips. Shields doubled as pillows. In a time when nightly demons, lice infestations, and pigs in your bed weren't considered unusual, you might think that sleepwalking was just one more medieval inconvenience.
But oh no, it was much more dramatic than that. In the Middle Ages, if you started wandering around in your sleep, people didn't chalk it up to stress or exhaustion. They assumed you were possessed, bewitched, or had unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation if you wanted to impress the local monk, was poorly understood and often deeply feared. The idea of someone rising from their straw pallet, eyes glazed, shuffling across the room and staring blankly at a wall was less harmless parasomnia and more devil's rehearsal dinner. Accounts from the time suggest people were genuinely spooked. Picture it, a man in a long nightshirt, candle in hand, mumbling Latin that he didn't actually speak, all while stepping over the family livestock. You'd think ghost or heretic or both. Some believed it was caused by bad humors, especially too much black bile. Others thought the soul was temporarily released during sleep, leaving the body to bumble around like an unattended mule. To prevent these nightly adventures, people tried everything from herbal remedies to, in more rural areas, just tying the person's leg to a chair. A primitive but effective restraint. If medieval life taught people anything, it was how to sleep through chaos, absolute chaos. Church bells, thunderstorms, screaming livestock, the occasional siege. For the sleep-deprived denizens of the Middle Ages, these were just ambient noises, the medieval version of white noise. Church bells, as we've noted, marked every sacred moment, including the ungodly hour of matins at 2 or 3 a.m. If you lived anywhere near a monastery, your dreams were soundtracked by regular, pious tolling. At some point, the brain just accepted it. Storms were frequent and terrifying. With no weather apps or triple-glazed windows, you experienced every clap of thunder like the world might be ending. Roofs leaked, windows rattled, chimneys howled like banshees. Still, people slept. They had to. Work didn't stop for insomnia. In the 14th century, people continued to sleep, somehow, through famine, war, and even the Black Death. When death carts rolled by in the morning, it was just a grim wake-up call. If you didn't wake up, well, some believed that was a mercy. There are even records of people sleeping through earthquakes, barn fires, and angry mobs. If you worked from sunup to sundown, ate barely enough to survive, and spent your day dodging mud, taxes, and spiritual damnation, you were going to fall asleep hard. Sleep was an escape hatch. We leave now the physical discomforts of the medieval night. We leave the straw pallets, the cold, the shared beds, and the tolling bells. We travel forward in time and across a vast ocean. We come to a small, cold village in New England. Here, the darkness was not from a lack of candles, but from a different kind of cold. It was a darkness of suspicion, of ideology, and a quiet, creeping fear that seeped into the timber-framed homes. We journey to Salem. In the winter of 1692, the village of Salem, Massachusetts, was cloaked in more than just snow. It was cloaked in tension. The people of Salem were Puritans, strict, devout, and deeply, profoundly superstitious. They believed they were engaged in a cosmic battle.
They were building a holy community in the wilderness, a city on a hill, which they believed was being watched by God and stalked by Satan. The devil, to them, was not an abstract idea. He was a real physical presence waiting in the dark woods just beyond their fences. Life was already hard. The village had recently split from the more affluent Salem town over politics and religion. Crops had failed. Smallpox had ravaged nearby communities. Wars with native tribes had left many traumatized and fearful. And inside the village, there was friction. There were disputes between neighbors over property lines, arguments over inheritance, and a deep, simmering resentment toward outsiders or anyone who didn't quite fit the rigid Puritan mold. Add to this the long, dark, bitter, and isolating New England winter, and the village was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. That spark came in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's own minister. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to behave strangely. They screamed uncontrollably. They threw things. They contorted their bodies into unnatural, painful-looking shapes. They spoke in gibberish. They claimed they were being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Neighbors whispered that they were cursed. Reverend Parris, unsure of what to do, called in a local doctor, William Griggs. After failing to find any physical cause, Dr. Griggs delivered the diagnosis that would plunge the village into chaos. A single, devastating word: evil. Witchcraft. That single word set fire to all the fears already simmering in Salem. In a place where witches were believed to be real, tangible, dangerous servants of the devil, the idea was not far-fetched. It was the explanation they were already primed to accept. And if the devil could worm his way into the minister's own household, what did that mean for the rest of the community? Once the idea of witchcraft took root, it spread like a social contagion. The afflicted girls, Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and soon others like Ann Putnam Jr., seemed to grow bolder. They found themselves at the center of the adult world's attention. They convulsed in court, they screamed during prayers, and they claimed they could see dark spirits and specters hovering over certain villagers. Prodded by adults who were desperate for answers, the girls began naming names. The first to be accused were, predictably, those with the least power, the least protection. They were women who already lived on the very edges of society. There was Sarah Good. She was a homeless beggar, known for muttering to herself when turned away from doorsteps. People now claimed her mumbling was not just sad, but a curse. She smoked a pipe. She snapped at children. She was unpleasant. She fit the mold of a witch because she didn't fit the mold of a pious, submissive Puritan woman. There was Sarah Osborne. She was an elderly woman who had scandalized the community. She hadn't attended church in over a year, and after her first husband died, she had married her indentured servant, attempting to merge their estates. A woman who defied convention and inheritance laws, clearly suspect. And then there was Tituba. She was the enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's own household. Originating from Barbados, her storytelling, her accent, and her non-European folklore already frightened the villagers. Under pressure, and possibly even physical beatings, Tituba confessed to witchcraft. But instead of clearing the air, her confession blew the situation wide open. She didn't just confess, she told a story. She told of a tall man in black, a figure everyone associated with the devil, who asked her to sign a book. She said she saw strange animals, yellow birds, red cats, and spectral dogs. But most damning of all, she claimed there were other witches in Salem working with her. That was all the court needed to hear. Tituba's confession gave the hysteria a script. Now, old grudges were disguised as righteous accusations. Property disputes turned into spectral assaults. If someone's cow died suddenly, it must be witchcraft. Logic was fading. Hysteria was now in control. As the accusations mounted and the small village jail began to fill, the colonial government stepped in. The new governor, William Phips, established a special court to deal with the chaos. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, from the Old French meaning to hear and determine. But what it really became was a factory for fear-driven justice. The court convened in June of 1692, and it was no ordinary tribunal. Its rules were warped by panic. Instead of requiring hard physical evidence or reliable witnesses, it allowed something far more dangerous: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was testimony that a spirit or specter of the accused had afflicted the victim. In other words, if one of the afflicted girls claimed to have seen your ghost-like form in a dream or floating across the room choking them, that was admissible in court as evidence against you. It was a legal catastrophe. You couldn't cross-examine a dream. And worse, you couldn't disprove it. How do you prove where your spirit wasn't last night? Children were now treated as star witnesses. Their seizures, screams, and gasps in the courtroom became theatrical and convincing. If a prisoner looked at an afflicted girl, she shrieked. If they didn't look at her, she shrieked louder. Defense lawyers? There were none. The concept didn't exist in these colonial trials. If you were accused, you stood alone, bewildered, before a panel of judges who already believed you were guilty. The system was diabolical. If you denied the charges, as any innocent person would, the afflicted girls writhed in agony, proving you were tormenting them at that very moment. If you confessed, you might be spared death, but only if you named others. The Salem rewarded lies and punished silence. In Salem, reason had stepped aside, and the law had become a mirror reflecting fear, not justice. On June 10, 1692, the gallows in Salem claimed its first victim. Her name was Bridget Bishop. She was not new to scandal. Her reputation made her an easy and early target. She wore bright red clothing, a scandalous choice in a world of black and gray. She ran a tavern, a place of drinking and questionable morals. And she had been accused of witchcraft years earlier, though acquitted. This time, there was no acquittal. Neighbors testified that her spirit pinched them in the night, that their babies died after she passed by. She denied everything vigorously. Still, the court, armed with spectral evidence, found her guilty. She was led to Gallows Hill, a barren, windswept patch of earth just outside Salem town. No prayer, no mercy. The rope was pulled. the crowd watched. And with that single execution, the machinery of death began to churn, and it would not stop for months. The hangings that followed came quickly. On July 19th, 5 more women were executed: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, Sarah Wilds, and Rebecca Nurse. The case of Rebecca Nurse was particularly shocking to the community. She was an elderly, pious woman, a beloved grandmother, and a respected member of the church. Even the jury, at first, found her not guilty. But under intense pressure from the court and the renewed fits of the afflicted girls, the verdict was reversed. Her final words were whispered through the air like a warning: "I am as innocent as the child unborn." It didn't matter. The noose did not discriminate between the pious and the outcast. In August, more executions followed. On September 22nd, the deadliest day, 8 people were hanged in a single morning. Among them was Martha Corey, a woman who had, early on, openly doubted the trials and mocked the girls. Her skepticism had cost her her life. Martha's husband, Giles Corey, met a different and perhaps more horrifying fate. Giles was an elderly and famously stubborn farmer. When he was brought to trial, he refused to enter a plea. He would not say guilty or not guilty. He knew the court was a sham. He knew that if he was tried, he would be found guilty and hanged, and his property would be seized by the state, leaving his children with nothing. The court, unable to proceed with a trial without a plea, resorted to an ancient, brutal English punishment: peine forte et dure. He was pressed to death. He was laid on the ground, and a large wooden board was placed on his chest. Stones were then piled on the board, slowly, cruelly, over a period of 3 days, in an attempt to force a plea from him. His final words, as legend has it, were a defiant grunt: "More weight." He died without entering a plea, and his property passed to his heirs. He had beaten the corrupt court at the cost of his life. While the executions claimed the spotlight, hundreds of others sat in cramped, foul-smelling jails. Salem's small jail couldn't hold them all. Accused witches were held in neighboring towns, chained to walls, starving, freezing, and forgotten. And they were not all adults. One of the most notable and tragic cases was that of Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of the executed Sarah Good. After her mother's arrest, little Dorothy was interrogated by the magistrates. Under pressure, confused, and likely terrified, she confessed to being a witch. Her answers, a mixture of childhood gibberish and fear, were taken as truth. She was arrested and imprisoned for 8 months in chains. When she was finally released after the hysteria had ended, she was mentally broken. She never recovered from the trauma. By the end of the hysteria, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, and at least 5 more, including Sarah Osborne, died in the squalid jails. Over 200 people were accused. By the fall of 1692, the spell of hysteria, which had held Salem in his grip for 9 months, finally began to crack. It did not crack because the court came to its senses. It cracked because the accusations grew too bold. The afflicted girls, empowered by their influence, began to overreach. They accused Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, He was well-educated, well-spoken, and had previously clashed with influential families in the village. He was charged with being the ringleader of the witches. On the day of his execution, Burroughs did something shocking. He stood on the gallows and flawlessly, powerfully recited the Lord's Prayer from beginning to end. This was stunning. A core tenet of the panic was that witches were believed to be incapable of reciting the prayer without error. The crowd fell silent. Some wept. Even hardened observers were shaken. The execution went on, but that moment planted a powerful seed of doubt. Then came the final straw. An accusation was leveled against Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps himself. Suddenly, the hysteria had reached the very top of the colony's social ladder. It was no longer just about outcasts and farmers. It was about the elite. Governor Phipps, already unnerved by the growing chaos and the execution of a minister, finally took action. In October 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, halting all pending executions. Public sentiment had shifted. It was like waking from a fever dream. Ministers, once silent or complicit, began to speak out. Increase Mather, one of the colony's most respected theologians, denounced the use of spectral evidence. It were better, he said, that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person should be condemned. It was a radical thought in a society that had, for months, believed exactly the opposite. By late 1692, the judicial system that had fueled the hysteria collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. A new, more cautious court was formed in early 1693. This time, things were different. Spectral evidence was no longer allowed. The judges were noticeably more skeptical. The result was immediate. Convictions slowed to a trickle and then stopped. The majority of the remaining 56 cases were acquitted outright. Those still in jail were quietly released. The gallows were silent. The jails emptied. But Salem was far from peaceful. The town was haunted, not by ghosts, but by guilt. What had started with a handful of sick girls had exploded into a communal act of destruction. Neighbors could no longer look each other in the eye. In 1706, Ann Putnam, Jr., who had been one of the most prolific of the afflicted girls, stood before her congregation and publicly apologized. She blamed her role in the trials on a great delusion by Satan. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent figures in the trials, was one of the few to admit wrongdoing. In a remarkable act of public penance, he stood in church in 1697 while a minister read out his confession and prayer for forgiveness. Slowly, the government responded to petitions from the families of the condemned. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of some of the victims, and offered limited financial restitution. The village of Salem eventually changed its name to Danvers, perhaps to distance itself from its infamous past. What happened in 1692 was a breakdown of logic, compassion, and legal integrity in the face of panic. Ordinary people became executioners simply by believing too easily and questioning too little. The Salem episode would be cited in debates about due process for centuries. The U.S. Constitution, written nearly a century later, would explicitly prohibit the kinds of measures that had doomed the accused. The guarantee of a right to legal counsel, the right to face your accusers, and the requirement for concrete evidence, these were hard-won principles, forged, in part, from the ashes of Gallows Hill. We leave now the fearful timber-framed houses of Puritan New England. We let the cold mists of Salem and its grim gallows fade. We travel back, much further back in time. We journey to a world not of hidden spiritual fears, but of open, brutal, and glorious ambition. We travel to the heart of the ancient world, the Roman Republic, a civilization that was, in its own way, also unraveling. We are here to meet a woman named Fulvia. She was born around 83 BCE into the elite yet slightly eccentric Fulvii family. Her father was known more for his bumbling speech than his political legacy, but Fulvia, she was, as our narrator says, born to command. From a young age, Fulvia would have been surrounded by the sharp-edged world of Roman power. Senators and generals debated policy in her home. Elections, treachery, and alliances were daily news. She would have seen how politics was played not just in the public forum, but in strategic marriages, in public funerals, in whispered rumors, and in backroom deals. While her early life is hazy, her later actions suggest a young woman who was observant, politically literate, and utterly, profoundly unafraid. This was also a period of unprecedented instability. The Republic was unraveling. Civil wars, populist revolts, and power struggles between generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar were turning Rome into a pressure cooker. The old rules were collapsing. Rather than recoil from this chaos, Fulvia would learn to use it. Her upbringing did not produce a modest, quiet matron. It produced a woman who saw politics not as a man's world to be feared, but as a battlefield to be mastered. Her first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, and it was anything but conventional. Clodius was no ordinary Roman noble. He was a populist agitator, a political arsonist with a flair for chaos, scandal, and street-level power. To the elite, he was dangerous. To the masses, he was a hero. And to Fulvia, he was a strategic opportunity. Fulvia was no silent partner in this marriage. Roman sources, though often hostile, suggest that she actively participated in her husband's chaotic political world. She engaged with his supporters, was visible during his campaigns, and managed their household as a political hub. They were a new kind of Roman power couple, bold, populist, and unapologetically aggressive. But this alliance, like all things in the late Republic, came at a cost. In 52 BCE, Clodius was murdered on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his political rival Titus Annius Milo. His death sent shockwaves through Rome. But Fulvia was not about to mourn quietly in the traditional cloistered way of a Roman widow. She staged a political funeral that historians still talk about today. She took Clodius's mutilated body and paraded it through the Roman Forum. She exposed his bloodied wounds for maximum effect. The public, who had adored Clodius, was horrified and enraged. Riots erupted. The Senate House itself was burned to the ground by the mob, a funeral pyre for their fallen hero.
Fulvia had turned her personal grief into a public political uprising. This was her first major political act, and it worked. She had manipulated public emotion and used spectacle as strategy.
Fulvia didn't linger. Political capital, she knew, had a short shelf life. Shortly after, she entered a second marriage, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and one of Julius Caesar's most passionate supporters. This was no romantic rebound. It was a calculated alliance. With Clodius gone, Fulvia needed a new political anchor. Curio was a bridge to the next great power block, Caesar. Through Curio, Fulvia remained embedded in the power dynamics of Rome, keeping her first husband's popular supporters active under Curio's new leadership. But the Roman world was collapsing fast. Civil war exploded between Caesar and Pompey. Curio, taking Caesar's side, led a military expedition to Africa in 49 BCE. It was a disaster. He was ambushed and killed. Once again, Fulvia was widowed. And once again, Rome waited to see if this twice-widowed woman would fade into the background. She didn't. Her most audacious partnership and her most dramatic chapter was still to come. Fulvia's third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony. He was the ambitious, charismatic, and loyal general of Julius Caesar. Their union, forged sometime around 47 BCE, wasn't merely a romantic attachment. It was a merger of power. Fulvia had already proven herself as a master of Roman street politics, a woman who could sway a mob. Antony, rising rapidly through the military and political ranks, needed that kind of savvy, ruthless support in the capital. Together, they formed one of the most politically potent couples of the late Republic. Antony, despite his brash exterior, understood her value. He allowed Fulvia to exercise a kind of authority that no Roman woman had ever publicly wielded before. She opened his correspondence. She issued orders in his absence. She sat in on political meetings and influenced military appointments. Roman sources, mostly hostile, depicted her as overbearing, power-hungry, and shrewish. But what disturbed them most wasn't her ambition. It was that she acted like a Roman man in a world that had no language, no protocol for such a woman. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic was plunged into chaos once more. Antony rushed to secure his position as Caesar's political heir. But it was Fulvia who held Rome itself. While Antony was all forming the second triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia acted as his representative in the capital. She managed his patronage networks, coordinated with street gangs, and ensured that Antony's supporters remained mobilized and loyal. In public, Fulvia appeared not just as Antony's wife, but as his proxy. In an act of breathtaking confidence, Roman coins were minted bearing both Antony's image and her name. This was an unprecedented acknowledgement of her status. She was the first Roman woman to appear on coinage, not as a goddess, but as herself. She wasn't hidden in the shadows of power. She stood in its full, blinding glare. While Mark Antony pursued military campaigns and, famously, Cleopatra across the Roman world, it was Fulvia who controlled the streets of Rome. She wasn't just his wife. She was his regent in all but name. In a period where violence, bribery, and raw influence kept order, Fulvia proved she could play the game as well as, if not better than, any man in the Senate. She financed loyal troops with her own fortune, offered bribes to keep public order, and ensured that any legislation passed favored Antony's future. She also made public appearances and maintained strong personal relationships with veteran soldiers, a politically vital demographic in the constant power struggles. But this accumulation of power came at a cost. Roman aristocrats, particularly the faction aligned with Octavian, Caesar's young, cold, and brilliant heir, and Antony's increasingly bitter rival, resented Fulvia's influence. They viewed her as a meddling woman with too much sway over legions, laws, and loyalties. Fulvia wasn't naive. She knew the tension between Antony and Octavian was growing. She could see that their uneasy alliance was cracking, and she understood something that neither man seemed to fully grasp yet. The Republic wasn't big enough for both of them. So, in 41 BCE, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She went to war against Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. With her husband Mark Antony still stationed in the east, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother, took it upon themselves to challenge Octavian's authority in Italy. Ostensibly, the cause was to defend Antony's interests and protect the land rights of Roman veterans loyal to him. But underneath it all, Fulvia's fingerprints were everywhere. This was not just politics. This was a military rebellion led by a Roman woman. The first and only time in Roman history that a woman would actively provoke and organize a civil war. The conflict, known as the Perusian War, was triggered by Octavian's controversial land redistribution. Fulvia seized on the growing discontent, portraying Octavian as a tyrant. With Lucius as her front man, she raised 8 legions and seized the city of Perugia. Make no mistake, ancient sources suggest this was Fulvia's war. She rallied troops, stirred the public, and corresponded with generals. Octavian, though surprised, acted with his signature speed and ruthlessness. He besieged Perugia through the long, cold winter, cutting off supplies and hammering the city into submission. By early 40 BCE, the city surrendered. Fulvia's bold gamble had unraveled. Lucius Antonius was spared, a political gesture by Octavian to avoid Antony. But Fulvia was exiled. The woman who had once commanded riots, marriages, armies, and public opinion was now deemed too dangerous for Roman soil. Banished from Rome, Fulvia landed in Sicyon, a city in Greece that had become a kind of diplomatic purgatory. She had gone to war not for personal gain, but in her husband's name. She believed, perhaps correctly, that she was defending Mark Antony's interests, his honor, and their shared vision of Rome. But what awaited her in exile wasn't a hero's welcome. It wasn't a grateful husband. It was silence. Fulvia had risked everything: her status, her alliances, her fortune, her life. And yet, Antony did not immediately rush to meet her. In fact, by the time Fulvia arrived in Greece, Antony was already entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether their legendary romance had fully begun or was merely brewing, the political and personal symbolism was crushing. While Fulvia was raising legions, enduring a siege, and starving in Perugia for his cause, Antony was raising goblets at banquets beside the Queen of Egypt. The betrayal cut deep. She had fought a war to protect his power in Italy, and in response, he let her hang out to dry. Some ancient historians, especially Plutarch, suggest that Antony was furious with her for launching the Perusian War without his direct approval. Others argue he secretly welcomed her downfall. Her health, after the stress of the siege and the humiliation of her exile, had begun to fail. After enduring it all, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BCE. She was around 43 years old. Her death was possibly from illness, stress, or, as some have romanticized, a broken heart. Her death provided Antony with a clean political exit. He met with Octavian shortly afterward. The Perusian War, they agreed, was all Fulvia's fault. And now that this troublesome woman was gone, they could make peace. As part of this renewed peace treaty, Antony agreed to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia. The triumvirs were temporarily united again, but only because Fulvia, the one woman bold enough to challenge their designs, was gone. Her legacy would be overshadowed by Cleopatra, but make no mistake, Fulvia was the prototype. In the centuries that followed her death, historians and writers struggled to place Fulvia in Rome's grand narrative, because Fulvia broke every rule of what a Roman woman was supposed to be. She didn't just advise power from the shadows, she became power, and that made her both unforgettable and deeply unsettling to a patriarchal world. In a society where women were expected to influence through whispers and marriage, Fulvia shouted through policy, war, and political theater. She was not a consort. She was a commander. Roman historians couldn't handle a woman who didn't stay in her place, so they rewrote her. They cast her as shrill, power-hungry, jealous, and disruptive. They blamed her for the civil strife. But if you read between the lines, a different figure emerges. Fulvia's only true deviation was that she was a woman acting like a Roman man. She was no more ambitious than Caesar, no more aggressive than Pompey, and far less ruthless than Octavian would eventually prove to be. She was the first Roman woman to mint coins with her name. She organized political factions, leveraged marriage as a tactical weapon, and manipulated Roman street politics with stunning effectiveness. Had she been born a man, she might have been remembered as a second Caesar. Instead, she was cast as the wicked woman who dared too much. Still, her legacy quietly lingered. Later Roman women, like Livia, the wife of Augustus, and Agrippina the Younger, the mother of Nero, would all operate in the shadow Fulvia helped carve. But Fulvia did it first, and with no imperial title to shield her. We leave her there, a force of nature erased by the men who followed. We journey forward now, far forward, past the fall of Rome, past the medieval night, past the anxieties of Salem. We travel to a different kind of struggle, a struggle not for personal power, but for collective freedom. We arrive in the United States in the heated, turbulent summer of 1963, a country once again teetering between two worlds, one rooted in centuries of oppression and another aching to breathe free. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a nation of profound, searing contradictions. It was the land of the free. Yet, in the Deep South, segregation wasn't just a social norm, it was the law. Whites only signs hung over restaurants, water fountains, and bathrooms. Black Americans were systematically and often violently barred from schools, buses, voting booths, and decent housing. Police brutality was rampant and unchecked. In places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful protesters, including children, were being met with snarling dogs and high-pressure fire hoses that could tear bark from trees. But change was coming. It was a tide rising against a wall. The civil rights movement had surged into the national spotlight. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts had become familiar headlines. Black Americans were no longer content with waiting. They were demanding their civil rights, and they were determined to make their voices heard in the one place that could not ignore them, the nation's capital. The idea of a mass march on Washington had been floating around for decades. Philip Randolph, a venerable labor organizer and longtime civil rights advocate, had first proposed the concept back in the 1940s to pressure President Roosevelt to desegregate the defense industry. Now, in 1963, the stakes were even higher. Randolph, along with other leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the vision. But the man at the center of the controlled chaos, the logistical genius who would make it all happen, was Bayard Rustin. Rustin was a master strategist, a Quaker, and a devout believer in nonviolence. He had studied in India, been jailed for his beliefs, and was often kept behind the scenes by other leaders because he was openly gay. But in just 8 short weeks, Rustin and his team transformed an idea into a reality. Pulling off a protest for over 100,000 people sounded like a logistical nightmare. Food, water, transportation, sound systems, thousands of bathrooms, medical teams, permits, crowd control. Yet somehow they made it happen. The march was officially called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This dual message was no accident. While Dr. King would later become the spiritual symbol of the day, Randolph and Rustin made sure the demands were just as much about economic justice, unemployment, a federal jobs program, and a minimum wage, as they were about civil rights. A soul, they argued, cannot be free if the stomach is empty. August 28, 1963. A sweltering, humid Wednesday in Washington, D.C. The sun was already hot by 9 a.m., and the humidity clung to the skin like a second shirt. But it didn't stop them. From every corner of the country, they came. By bus, by train, by carpool, and some even by foot. They came from Mississippi and Michigan, from Alabama and New York. Over 250,000 people in total, converging on the National Mall like a great rising tide of hope. They were black, white, young, old, students, clergy, factory workers, and celebrities. Some wore their Sunday best, others clutched protest signs. And yet, there was no chaos. Despite the government's deep-seated fear of riots and unrest, the scene was astonishingly calm, almost reverent. The National Guard was on standby. Hospitals were on alert. Liquor sales were banned for the day. But none of it was needed. Volunteers directed foot traffic. The Red Cross handed out water. Groups sat under the trees, singing freedom songs, holding hands, and cheering as new marchers arrived.
Celebrities joined in, not as stars, but as citizens. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan. But no one was there for autographs. They were there to witness history and lend their voices to a cause bigger than any one person. There was no pushing, no looting, no violence. Instead, there was a shared, unspoken understanding that this wasn't just a protest. This was a sacred moment. At exactly noon, the official program began. Leaders took the stage. Marian Anderson, the great singer who had once been banned by the Daughters of the American Revolution from singing at Constitution Hall because of her race, now sang for thousands beneath the open sky at the foot of Lincoln. As the hours passed, the tension grew, not from unrest, but from anticipation. The man everyone was waiting for, the final speaker of the day, had not yet spoken. By mid-afternoon, the crowd had grown quiet, weary from the heat, but electric with anticipation. Standing in the shade of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. He wore a dark suit, a neatly tied tie, and an expression of deep calm. He carried prepared remarks, typed and written collaboratively with his advisors the night before. It was a good speech, a solid one, but perhaps not a historic one. He began with that measured, prepared intensity, outlining the grim realities of segregation, police violence, and the promissory note that America had given its black citizens, a check that had come back marked insufficient funds. His voice, a rich baritone, rose and fell like a sermon. The crowd listened in rapt attention, some nodding, some wiping away tears, others holding signs that simply read, "Now." But then, something happened that changed the tone of the entire event, and arguably the trajectory of the civil rights movement itself. Standing just behind King was the gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier that day. She knew King well. She knew his sermons. And as he neared the end of his prepared remarks, she suddenly cried out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin! Tell them about the dream!" And King did. He set aside his notes. He gripped the podium, and he launched into a passage, a theme he had delivered in other cities, but never like this, never on this stage. "I have a dream," he said, and the crowd leaned in, a rumble of recognition rising. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Each phrase rang louder, clearer, more resolute. "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." It wasn't a speech anymore. It was a vision. It was a prayer. It was a lightning bolt through history. By the time King closed with the words of the old spiritual, "Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the crowd erupted. Applause, tears, shouts of joy. They knew.
They knew they had just witnessed something more than oratory. They had heard prophecy. While the world saw unity, inspiration, and poetic justice on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, behind the scenes, the March on Washington was anything but simple. What looked like a perfectly synchronized movement was, in truth, held together with string, sweat, and a lot of last-minute tense compromise. The chief architect, Bayard Rustin, had to battle not just logistics, but politics. He was constantly under scrutiny, not just because he was openly gay and a former communist, but because some civil rights leaders and politicians feared his identity would be used to discredit the movement. Then there was the issue of women's voices. Despite the critical foundational roles played by women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, none were invited to deliver major speeches. Rosa Parks was in the crowd that day, revered by all, a symbol of the movement, but she was not given the microphone. The only woman to speak that day was Daisy Bates, a hero of the Little Rock integration crisis. She was permitted to read a brief, prepared tribute to women, but it was not a main address. Behind the powerful optics of the march, the movement still struggled with its own hierarchies and blind spots. And in that crowd, there was a young John Lewis, just 23 years old, representing the fiery, impatient Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. His original prepared speech had been so fiery, so uncompromising, criticizing the Kennedy administration and promising to march through the South the way Sherman did, that senior leaders, including A. Philip Randolph, asked him to tone it down minutes before he went on stage. He agreed, reluctantly, but his call for radical change still shook the crowd. Meanwhile, the federal government watched with clenched teeth. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had assigned over 100 agents to spy on the organizers. They bugged hotel rooms, followed key figures, and compiled dossiers. They were convinced the march would turn violent. When nothing of the sort happened, they simply doubled down on their surveillance, especially of Dr. King. The March on Washington was historic, yes, but it was also deeply human, imperfect, messy, political, and unfinished. The sun began to dip behind the Washington Monument as the crowd slowly dispersed. People hugged, cried, sang, and lingered as long as they could, reluctant to leave what felt like sacred ground. The march was over. The speeches had been delivered. The world had watched. And now the question hung heavy in the humid August air. What happens next? In the immediate days that followed, the media reaction was cautiously positive. Major newspapers acknowledged the historic nature of the event, though often with a tone of detached curiosity. Some called it orderly and dignified, which was, as our narrator notes, code for no one rioted. Few outlets gave much space to the specific demands of the march, the call for a federal jobs program or a $2 minimum wage. But everyone covered Dr. King's speech. That at least could not be ignored. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the idea of the march, watched it unfold on television with growing admiration. He called the event impressive and met with civil rights leaders at the White House immediately afterward. But legislative movement remained agonizingly slow. His proposed Civil Rights Act was still stalled in Congress, caught in the claws of a Southern filibuster.
Some activists were deeply disappointed. They had hoped the march would result in immediate, tangible action. Instead, it was back to the grind, back to organizing, marching, resisting, and mourning. Just 18 days later, that reality hit hard. On September 15, 1963, a bomb planted by the Ku Klux Klan exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. 4 young black girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair, were killed while getting ready for Sunday school. The dream had been voiced, yes, but the nightmare wasn't over. The March on Washington didn't just rattle the conscience of America, it reshaped its moral landscape. What had begun as an audacious act of protest became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement's legacy. In legislative terms, the march did not yield immediate victories, but it created an unstoppable moral momentum. Less than a year later, in July 1964, after Kennedy's assassination and the tireless maneuvering of President Lyndon B. Johnson, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law. It outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination. And in 1965, after the televised brutality of the Selma March, the Voting Rights Act followed, striking at the very heart of Jim Crow laws. Would these bills have passed without the march? Possibly. But would they have had the same moral force, the same undeniable public pressure? Probably not. The march had shown America its own conscience. For Dr. King, the speech propelled him from a respected leader to a global icon. But fame came with a cost: increased surveillance, constant threats, and, ultimately, assassination in 1968. More than 60 years have passed since that summer afternoon. The question remains, has the dream been realized or merely delayed? In some ways, progress is undeniable. The legal framework of segregation was dismantled. The presence of black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a 2-term U.S. president was unthinkable in 1963. And yet, the original demands of the march, the ones often overshadowed by the poetry of the dream, still echo unresolved. The call for a living wage, for economic justice, is still unmet. Racial disparities in education, housing, employment, and healthcare remain entrenched. Police brutality, the very thing that sparked so much of the early organizing, continues to ignite outrage and protest. Jobs part of the March for Jobs and Freedom is still, for many, the part of the dream that remains furthest from reality. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have taken up the mantle, often using the same rhetoric, marching on the same streets, and demanding the same basic human rights. The march was never meant to be the conclusion. It was a flashpoint, a stake in the ground, a declaration, not a resolution. The comfort of the modern night. The dream remains, battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but still undeniably alive. We have traveled so far tonight. We have drifted from the cold, damp straw beds of the medieval world, where sleep was a fragmented, shared, and itchy affair. We have stood in the silence of a paranoid courtroom in Salem, where fear could turn a neighbor into a monster. We have felt the ruthless, fiery ambition of a Roman woman who dared to command armies in a world that tried to erase her. And finally, we stood together,
with 250,000 people on the sun-baked grass of the National Mall, listening to a dream of what a nation could be. The past is a heavy thing. It is filled with the cold, the fear, the struggle, the injustice, and the profound enduring hope of all those who came before us. But now, our journey is over. We can let those struggles fade. We can leave those anxieties behind. You are here, in your own time, in your own quiet space. You are safe. Feel the comfort of your own bed, a simple, private luxury that your medieval ancestors could only have dreamed of. Feel the peace of the modern night, free from the fears of demons, or the tolling of a 2 a.m. bell, or the panic of a witch trial. There is nothing left to do, nothing to analyze. You can let the voices of the past, the echoes of their lives, fade. Let them dissolve into the quiet hum of the present. You can let go. And as we fade to silence, I wish you a deep, a restorative, and a truly uninterrupted sleep. Good night.